We use a formal consensus process, which means there is a structure to how we do it, right? One of the most common things I hear about why people don't want to use consensus is because it just turns into this big shouting match and everybody needs to get heard and nothing gets done. Well, that's largely because you don't have a formal process for how this thing works, right? There are roles that should ideally be assumed in the room, right? We'll lay out some of what those are. For example, agenda planner, right? The agenda is probably the most important piece of having a good, successful meeting in a consensus-based decision-making model, right? If we can't agree on how much time we're going to spend on each thing and what we're going to cover, then we don't even have a basis for consensus, right? So the agenda planner is gathering information from all the stakeholders in the organization and gaining agreement on what our agenda is going to be. And then our first thing in every meeting is everybody okay with this agenda? Do we need to modify it in any way? And if we do, we come to consensus on that. Does that make sense?
And to your point about discussion strategies, that can even be included in your agenda. So when you're looking at, this is the topic, this is the style of discussion that we're going to have around this topic based on those needs.
Another really common role is the role of facilitator. And the facilitator is the person who keeps the conversation flowing. The facilitator is in service to the conversation. Does that make sense? The idea is try to make sure that all voices are heard and that you're keeping a watch on the vibe in the room, how people are interacting, making sure that those people who are not interacting have a way to interact if at all possible. Your job is to facilitate the conversation. And that's an important role. It takes training. And so we actually rotate that role through our leadership collectives so that everybody has an opportunity to facilitate at some point in time.
So some kind of public scribe. So this is and in small groups, you don't necessarily need all of these roles to be fulfilled, right? Or people can multitask and have more than one role. But if you're talking about medium-sized group or larger group, some of these other roles are really valuable. The public scribe, that's the person who is doing the whiteboard, doing the sticky notes, so the facilitator doesn't have to worry about doing that while facilitating the conversation. And then the note taker, this is kind of the secretary role. In large groups, you might want to have multiple note takers because the note taker's job is to hear the voices in the space and try to convey that down to paper. What was said, what was decided. Not everyone hears everything the same way. So sometimes having more than one person in that role for larger groups can be really helpful. And then having that person, as you're making decisions and as you're going through your process, they can remind you of what you talked about. They can help to clarify when somebody says, oh, what was that idea? Or I forgot what so-and-so said.
Yeah, and those then become obviously the meetings of the minute, or the minutes of the meeting. The minutes of the meeting moving forward. But to Amy's point about having multiple note takers, again, we talk about areas of like caucus group, but consensus can be done in multicultural environments as well. And in multicultural environments, it may be really helpful to have different affinity groups have a different note taker. Does that make sense? Because then you've got somebody who's listening specifically to that group, yeah, and making sure they get heard.
May I ask how you put that together? I mean, so you have the meeting, you have 3 note takers, and how does it all get put together? Or does it?
Yeah, so sometimes it's decided upon before the meeting who the note takers will be, and then at the end of the meeting, the note takers might kind of give a brief overview, and then it's anything that needs to be agreed upon in the meeting gets agreed upon, and then anything else can be collated and, agreed upon at some later point by the group. Either by email or whatever your platform is, maybe it comes back in a paper form the next meeting. Another role is timekeeper, and so this isn't to add the stress of, we've got 5 minutes left on this topic, it's to take away the pressure that we feel when we're having these conversations if everyone has to be watching the time. So the timekeeper's job is to actually to remove the time pressure by being the person who's responsible for the time. So what they often do, depending on how long you've allocated for the discussion, they might say, you're halfway through, you're 3/4 of the way through, you've got 2 minutes, and that can help you navigate any time issues that you might be having in your discussion. If you need to navigate or negotiate to extend the discussion time. And I think that it's helpful to think of things as not going late or going over time.
And you may decide that you really don't want to take another 5 minutes to discuss this. Maybe we need to take this out of the meeting and move on, and we'll come back to it in the next meeting, right? And in the meantime, the group that brought this forward or that had issues with it can take it to the side and have a separate discussion. Does that make sense? The idea is not about we have to be wedded to the time, right? One of the ways that white supremacy culture manifests is in a sense of urgency. We have to get this done in this meeting. Why? If it's time sensitive, have a meeting for that, right? If it is not time sensitive, why do we need to make sure that we get it decided in this 15-minute segment of our meeting? So don't be wedded to it, but be respectful of it, right? We have X amount of time in the day. I can't be in a 3-hour meeting, right? I can be in a 1 hour and 10-minute meeting if we've agreed on it.
Another role is the role of the advocate. So this is someone who can be called upon when someone seems to be unable to be understood by the group for whatever reason. Sometimes this is a person might be having trying to address their concerns and the group is not hearing them or not understanding them. Sometimes there's a lot of emotional charge around that. Sometimes that the individual will call upon the advocate to actually step out of the space with them. And that the advocate's role really is to assist that person in being heard. It might involve speaking for that individual. That's sort of a last resort. But often it is just some time to collect thoughts, clarify, and then kind of come back to the group. It's a really helpful role.
Yeah, I think that it's worth remembering that no one gets out of this life unscathed, and we all come with trauma. And sometimes that trauma can manifest in ways that we weren't expecting, right? And having the ability to have somebody to go to that you can step out and have a conversation with, and then come back into a conversation with everyone else is really helpful. Think of it as a pastoral role, the advocate.
Another role is the peacekeeper, or sometimes that role is called the vibe watcher. And the vibe watcher's role is to be aware of the overall mood and tone of the room. And in formal process, often the vibe watcher is sort of the only role that has the right to just interrupt without sort of being recognized or waiting their turn to speak in line behind.
And
everyone else who's waiting.
Sorry, I'm stepping.
No, I paused.
I'm now the vibe watcher, so I had the chance to do that. That is a role that we have in every ARE meeting. We have a vibe watcher, and their role is twofold. One is to look for tension in the room, right? If there's tension in the room, another way that white supremacy culture manifests is a right to comfort and a fear of open conflict. So often, even though we're feeling anxiety, we're not going to say it because then it becomes a huge issue and then it makes me uncomfortable, right? So that may be just everybody. Let's stop and take a breath, right? Maybe we need to sing for a little bit. You know what I mean? And that the vibe watcher can do that and kind of get everybody back into the space of being able to communicate with each other. The other thing they do is afterwards to do a process review. How did we do during the meeting? And so we can continually learn and hone these skills.
the last two will just cover quickly. A role that you can utilize is doorkeeper. So this is, especially useful if you have people that frequently come late, 10, 15 minutes late. So the doorkeeper's role, in a small group, you're not going to have a doorkeeper. But in a group of 100 or 50 or 20 even folks, if you have someone who's out by the door, their role is to bring the late folks up to speed. They might even, depending on the conversation or the discussion, say, why don't you wait until the next agenda item before you jump in participating? That's an option. And another one that can be helpful even in small groups is the role of the stack keeper. So that is the person who keeps track of the raised hands. So that you, as a participant, you've raised your hand, and you've been recognized by the stack keeper. You know your name's on the list. Now you're not like, I'm next. Are they going to remember that I'm next? Or you don't have that like, I'm going to hold my hand up until I get called on. It takes away some pressure for you so that you can really be open and engaged in the conversation without having to worry about when your turn is coming. So we are, we have 12 minutes. And so with what I'd like for them to have at least one more active
I agree.
thing. So maybe we'll skip to that.
Yep.
And then what we have time for,
Right, and remember that all the resources are going to be available online. Yeah.
So, starting off, yes.
Have you ever tried to do this in the whole church?
So the largest groups that I personally participated in are about 50 to 100. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
over what length of time might a decision be made with multiple meetings, let's say?
Well, so we're going to talk about that next. That is exactly what we're going to talk about next. Okay.
It really depends on the issue. So,
And
5 minutes for 100 people,
And how much work has been done ahead of time?
3 months, 2 years.
Depends on the issue.
It depends a lot.
But because that's another common question, right? What do we do in large groups? This is used all over the world in large groups. The Quakers do this in every one of their Quaker houses. And they facilitate a meeting like GA with 3,500 to 4,000 people using a consensus-based decision-making model. It can be done. It's all about having the process. Yes.
There's a book called Roberta's Rules of Order, which covers a lot of these.
Roberta's Rules of Order, which covers a lot of these concepts. I love that. By the way, I hate Robert. I just want to say that. Not a fan. Roberta's Rules of Order. We base our work on a book called On Conflict and Consensus. On Conflict and Consensus, which was written by a gentleman who came out of, I'm sorry?
Butler.
Yeah, Butler, who came out of Food Not Bombs and then out of the Occupy movement.
So we're going to take you back to the first step and have you do another little group activity. So your first step is just to clarify this issue. I'm going to give you this issue. You're going to work together to come up with some clarifying questions. So one of your ministry groups, say, small group of 15 to 20 people, is planning, desires to have, they're completing some kind of thing, project, curriculum, and they're planning a shared celebratory meal. And so your task, should you choose to accept it, is to together just quickly come up with some clarifying questions about this issue. And so an example would be, some examples might be around dietary needs, right? Accessibility, cost. So pair up. Any questions?
First of all,
You can.
will you tell us what the
So this is just a conversation.
Okay.
we're gonna share the time together and just work together to come up with some questions you have about the needs around this issue.
Can you just state one more time the presenting issue?
The presenting issue is that you have a small ministry group that's completed some kind of activity, 15 to 20 people, and they want to have a shared celebratory meal together.
So what are the clarifying questions?
Okay, if we could kind of come back. I know, the challenge is we got to, if everybody, let's ask this, are people willing to stay a little longer? Let's see if we can consensus around some extra time. We have a half an hour between here and the next one. If you're willing, we're certainly willing to take a little extra time.
No.
Okay.
So we see some no that will
Okay.
So we don't really have time for kind of a talk back, but I just want to plant the seed of, did you in this conversation encounter or hear anything that sort of surprised you? Something that maybe you wouldn't have thought of, that the folks that you were chatting with were like, hey, what about this? That's really the cool part about this beginning process, is that everyone has different perspectives, different ideas, they see different things, and we'll talk about in the second part of this is why it's so important that everyone's at the table. If everyone's not at the table, well, we're going to be missing some things in this part of the process.
So we talked for a while about some of the issues of the dinner, and then realized that we were talking about different dinners, different ways of doing it entirely. Going out to a restaurant is versus I was thinking that we would ask the group to come bring food in after the meeting.
Yeah, that's really great.
And that speaks to a commonality of language, right? Which is, again, something that will emerge as you begin to work in this culture.
So what we want to leave you with is the concept of working a proposal. And something that can be really helpful in this process for your group is to have some kind of proposal form that outlines the values of your group and the things that you want to make sure are considered and reflected every time you make decisions. So that will depend a lot on your group. I was going to say that just real quick. The value is that it really helps you to kind of to prepare for your meeting and to prepare to make a proposal. So sometimes you're creating this together on the fly, and sometimes maybe a subcommittee is coming to a bigger group meeting with a proposal in hand. They've already spent some time, weeks, months, years, working on this proposal, and now it's ready to be discussed in the larger group. So there's a lot of options for this, but it helps a lot with process.
And this speaks to two things we talked about earlier, which is how long can it take for a consensus process to happen? It depends on how much work you've done ahead of time. So working the proposal is about making sure that you've got a proposal that has thought through issues and concepts and so on, and is ready to come to consensus in the larger group, right? So that you're minimizing the need for clarifying questions, concerns, all of those things. You've thought about them ahead of time. Then the other thing that it does is we use a blocking process. So blocking is another piece of the consensus process. Block says, I disagree with this so much that I am willing to leave the group over it. Does that make sense?
It's a veto.
It's a deal. It's not, I don't like this proposal. It is, I am so opposed to this that I am not willing to be in community with you anymore. That's how we address it. And the only time we feel, and this is a decision we made as part of our covenant, the only time we feel that's appropriate is when something is out of mission. It is not consistent with the mission and vision of the organization. It doesn't meet our values. That is a perfectly appropriate reason to block, right? But otherwise, come back to the consensus. Find a way, right? And we start with a culture of, yes, we're going to get this through. How do we make that happen for you? And part of what that can look like is, for those folks who have brought up concerns, we either find a way to address the concern, or we note the concern as part of the proposal and make sure that when we are implementing that proposal, we are keeping that in mind consistently all the way through, and then report back on how we did that.
And we're really happy to continue the conversation about the testing for agreement, kind of the final part of the process. So if you, if you have time during the break, we can continue that conversation, or if you have other specific questions, we'd be happy to sit and chat with you or talk in small groups. And I want to thank everyone for spending a whole hour with us.
I hope this was helpful. Again, obviously, all we can do in this amount of time is plant seeds. But if you are interested in learning more about consensus, there's a ton of materials that are out there on the web. Come to uuare.org, you can find a bunch there. And by the way, we do consulting work. So we would be happy to come out and do a 2 or 3 day session for you or your board to take you through what it looks like to move into a full consensus model.
Where are you located?
We are located all over the place. So UUARE we're made up of members from all over the place. We have a person here from Canada right now. One of our steering committee members lives in New Zealand. And then we have trainers, so as a subcommittee that can go out and do this as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming.